Well, good evening to everyone. So we are, as some of you know, we always grateful for visitors from the care group, but we are covering some extra biblical sources. And one of the questions that I've already introduced to everyone that continues to intrigue me is the question of why. Why does this matter? And I suspect that because I keep asking myself that question, that you may be wondering about that too. And I'm going to continue throughout this quarter as I am engaged in these lessons to address that question. I hope effectively, especially in light of last Wednesday, because I rambled a bit, and I know that. It's a tendency that is common for me, and I have to fight it. Didn't fight it very well last Wednesday. But in any case, I've given those of you who have been here in the past the rundown of the various biblical sources that I'm planning on covering. And we are in early days. This is, I believe, only our third meeting in this series. And so this one is Historians number 2. And here are the extra biblical historians that I'm planning on dealing with. I've already briefly dealt with Suetonius and Tacitus, and I have yet to deal with Josephus and Pliny the Younger, Mara bar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata, and although a biblical historian, Eusebius, sometimes called the father of church history. And with him, we'll transition into the ante-Nicene, Nicene, and post-Nicene fathers, what are typically referred to as the early church fathers, quote unquote, and some of their writings. So here are the images that I've used to represent Suetonius and Tacitus, pagan Roman authors. And if I can enlarge a little bit more upon some of the things that I said last time as regards the Caesars, and as regards the more specific information that I shared with you in the authors that we're dealing with here, Suetonius and Tacitus, specifically Suetonius' 12 Caesars, which is the only one of his works that has survived, and Tacitus' Annals. I gave you just the very, very concise excerpts from their works that specifically speak, as we understand it, of Christus or Christ, and the followers that both refer to as Christians. And from that, you may be thinking, well, that doesn't really tell us a lot, because again, these were really concise. But they do tell us important things. Tacitus confirms that Christ paid what he refers to, at least in English translation, as the ultimate penalty. He was executed. He confirms that it was during the authority of Pontius Pilate in Judea. And I've already told you, I think on the first Wednesday, that some people, apparently not knowing their classical original sources, had questioned the very historicity of Pontius Pilate, and hence the importance of the Pilate inscription that I shared with you on our first Wednesday. But beyond that, it's not just material that is specifically focused upon Christ or the Christians. And that's one of the reasons why I went into the detail that I did as regards the 12 Caesars, because we're trying to understand here that culture matters, that history matters, that the important people that the world looks at as important in terms of the breadth and span of history, they have an impact upon the Bible, well, not the Bible, but upon our understanding of the Bible, and upon really the development of Christianity, the Christian faith. And so if you're thinking that because I just shared with you literally a handful of phrases from these two, that's it, what's the point of that? Well, again, it's a bit more complicated than that. And I'm going to indulge, I'm afraid, a little bit more along these lines and share with you a little bit more about the other Caesars that came after the Julio-Claudian family, the dynasty that Suetonius writes about. And I'll use him as well as Tacitus to speak of those rulers that come after the Julio-Claudians. Okay, but our focus tonight is going to be mainly on Josephus, who is a major extra-biblical source. I'm sure you all have heard, as I have, many preachers and teachers refer to Josephus as one of the major extra-biblical sources concerning the biblical record and all things Jewish. And he's important enough that I think he merits a good bit more than Suetonius and Tacitus. And then if we have the time, I would like to speak briefly about Pliny the Younger. Jay Crook is not here. Jay loves puns, and he knows I don't care for them. And so I introduced these four last time, and after I got home, I found on my phone an email from Jay. He said, "Hey, I watched your lesson." He wasn't able to be with us in person, so he watched it. And then he said, "I don't think you have to worry. I think you'll have plenty of time to talk about these people." Sheesh. Well, I thanked him for his email. He's a great guy, Jay. But I don't like puns. Okay, so, and if you're out there listening, Jay, I love you, brother. So, Josephus. Josephus is like a lot of the people I have treated and will be treating. We don't know what he looked like. So this is, as you can see, a very early publication of the collected writings of Josephus. And you look at that image on the frontispiece and you think, okay, that's what a Jewish historian should look like. There's an engraved version of it. But in point of fact, this is by a man by the name of John Sartain, who made this engraving in the 1880s. I may have shown this to you last time. And I can say with absolute confidence, Sartain knew no more about what Josephus looked like than the man in the moon. He just thought Jewish, a man of the upper class, and so he gives him a big beard and a turban, and that's it. Nobody knows what the man looked like. But an art historian picked out this bust from the Roman veristic tradition. Veristic means extremely truthful, extremely lifelike. And the Romans were famous for these kinds of things. And I guess on the basis of that nose, this art historian said, it's the right time. I think this may be Josephus. Well, he didn't know what Josephus looked like either. It's just his judgment. And isn't there something out there about the Roman nose, which is also very prominent? So maybe this is a Roman, maybe this is a Romanized Jew. I think it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, but I'm going to go with the Romanized Jew, and therefore we're going to utilize that bust to represent Josephus. So it said, such is his stature that I think he merits a bit more generous treatment than either Suetonius or Tacitus, about whom, by the way, very little is really known. But Josephus wrote a lot, and a lot of his writings have come down to us, and among them is a biography. So we know an awful lot about Josephus. He was born Yosef ben Mattathieu in Jerusalem around 37 to a wealthy family. His father was of priestly descent. His mother claimed Hasmonean royal ancestry, which in the ancient world, if you can claim to be descended from royalty, you're pretty up there, even if you are Jewish. And I'm speaking here from the standpoint of the Greeks and the Romans who habitually looked down upon the Jews. In AD 63, when he was about 26, he actually served as an envoy to Rome on behalf of the Jewish people. I thought that was interesting. And perhaps it's in that context that he developed an affinity and understanding to some degree of Rome and Roman people that helps us to better understand what he does in the latter part of his life. Because from the Jewish perspective, it's not a good thing that he does. So, with the outbreak of the Jewish-Roman War in AD 66, as a man of high stature, high placement socially within the Jewish community in Judea, he was appointed the military governor of Galilee and began training Jewish resistant troops to fight the Romans. And apparently was considered a pretty capable general, but the Romans are always better at these things. So, fighting against the Romans, who were led by the father and son duo, Vespasian and Titus, later to become emperors themselves, Josephus and the remnants of his troops were besieged in a cave at the siege of Yadfat, which lasted for some weeks. And so this is never a good thing when you're besieged and you don't get relief from an ally or a friend, because sooner or later you run out of water and food and things look really desperate. And so that's what happened here. And so Josephus and the remnants of his men were called upon to surrender. And they did what in that time for the Jewish people was considered honorable. They decided that they would all kill themselves rather than surrender to a hated enemy, the Roman forces. So they drew lots for that purpose. And Josephus happened to be one of the two remaining men. And they surrendered. And that doesn't really look good, does it? So they surrendered to the Roman forces. And not only that, but Josephus, originally a prisoner and then a slave of Vespasian, he claims that he was inspired by God to hail Vespasian the coming emperor. And he claims that this was not even in Vespasian's mind. But such was the gratitude of Vespasian that he decided to free this slave. And in consequence, he took Josephus under his wing. Josephus actually acted as a negotiator with the defenders during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, which is the climactic point. By that time, Vespasian has gone back to Rome to make his bid for imperial purple. And Titus is the son of Vespasian who's left in charge. And AD 70 is the climactic moment in the Jewish wars with the Romans, which results in absolute destruction for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And so imagine being the negotiator between these two forces. We read about the hatred that Jewish people felt toward tax collectors who were Jewish, largely. What do you think they felt toward Josephus? Because this would have gotten out. This would have been known that he was the survivor of this troop who had killed themselves, and he surrendered, and now he's the friends of the Romans and a negotiator for the Romans. And there's no telling what he put up with and what he had to endure during this period of time. So not surprisingly, when Titus, having secured victory over the Jews, his father, now emperor in Rome, leaves Judea to go to Rome, Josephus goes with him. And so in AD 71, Josephus goes to Rome as a part of the entourage of Titus. There he becomes a Roman citizen. He's already been freed by Vespasian, and so in keeping with the cultural mores of the day, he takes the family name, Flavius. That's why we know of him as Titus Flavius Josephus, because he is a client. He is indebted to these powerful Romans, now an emperor and an emperor in the wings, waiting to become an emperor, and so adapts the family name. Well, while he's in Rome and under that patronage, he writes all of his known works. And these are the Jewish Wars, the Antiquities of the Jews, Against Apion, and the Life of Josephus. And then he dies in Rome about 100. It's estimated that these are circa dates approximately, that he's around 62 or 63. So there's a little bit of life story about Josephus, and you can tell already that he's a person with a colored background, a checkered background, not the best reputation, but nevertheless, he's very proud of his heritage. He's very proud of his family line. He's very proud of being a Jew. And that should be borne in mind, as German scholar and geographer Karl Ritter reminds us. So here's what Ritter has to say about Josephus. He says, outside of the scriptures, Josephus holds the first and the only place among the native authors of Judea. Josephus, however, is to be used with great care. As a Jewish scholar, as an officer of Galilee, as a military man, and a person of great experience in everything belonging to his own nation, he attained to that remarkable familiarity with his country in every part, which his antiquarian researches so abundantly evince. So he knows a lot about Jewish culture. He shares a lot of his knowledge with the reader, but you have to be careful when you deal with Josephus, because as Ritter goes on to say, he was controlled by political, and I could add, social, ethnic, and cultural motives. His great purpose was to bring his people, the despised Jewish race, into honor with the Greeks and Romans. And this purpose underlay every sentence and filled his history with distortions and exaggerations. So basically, Ritter is saying that he wants to bring the Jewish people, as an historian, up to the level of the Greeks and the Romans, and cast them for the Gentile world in the same honorable light as a great nation with a great culture. And to that end, either consciously or unconsciously, he's not averse to exaggerating things and making things perhaps a bit bigger than they really are. And incidentally, that's one reason why history continually needs to be rewritten, because historians are people, and people are biased. And sometimes that bias comes through unconsciously, sometimes it's deliberate. I'm sure you all know sometimes historians just lie. And you gotta be a bit careful really with anything written by a human being, because either unconscious bias or deliberate falsehood can mislead. The truth is really hard to get at. Okay, so that gives us, I hope, a foundation for a little bit closer look at the immediate context historically and culturally and politically of the time. So one of the last Julio-Claudians that I shared a little bit with you about was old Uncle Claudius. And if you were here last Wednesday, then I told you that when Caligula died in AD 41, then old Uncle Claudius was elevated to the throne. He was the uncle of Caligula. Caligula was crazy. He was just really imbalanced. And he did vile and brutal and vicious things. It's been well said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nero and Caligula embody those thoughts. But in fact, Claudius was, in the Julio-Claudian family, the uncle of Caligula. And as I told those of you who were here last Wednesday, you might wonder, well, why didn't Claudius come to the imperial throne before Caligula? And I told you why. Because Claudius was an embarrassment. He was thought to be a half-wit. He slobbered and drooled when he got excited. He stuttered habitually. He was known to pick his nose in public, which I guess throughout history has never been a good thing. His own mother said he was a half-made man thrown into the world. Can you imagine your mother saying that about you? And when Caligula was assassinated in AD 41, and then the soldiers just ran rampage through the imperial palace. They killed his wife, they killed his child, a little girl, a baby girl. Who knew who they were going to butcher next? And the story has it, this is not in Suetonius, but it's a legend, and I think it's likely true, that one of these soldiers, no doubt with a bloody sword in his hand, looking for fresh victims, saw some boots underneath a drape. And he tore the drape away, and there was old Uncle Claudius just shivering and shaking, sure that he was about to be thrust through. Probably as a joke, this soldier knelt down and hailed him as Caesar. Well, old Uncle Claudius is not a fool in spite of everything that everyone says, including his mother. He takes opportunity to have himself taken to the Praetorian camp. He promises the soldiers there a great donative, a bonus to their pay. If they'll support him, they do. He's Caesar. It's just that easy. Well, I'm sure it was pretty frightening. But in any case, he becomes the next emperor. And probably to everyone's surprise, he proves to be highly intelligent. In fact, he was no fool. He was a scholar. He wrote histories, 30-volume history of the Etruscan people, which has not survived. Etruscanologists drool when they think about the possibility of having that one come down to us. He wrote a history of his father, whom he greatly admired and loved. He was a highly intelligent man, a capable administrator. His only problem was that he loved too many women. And his third wife, according to Suetonius, conspired with her son, Nero, and they poisoned him. But this was the Claudius that sent the Jews out of Rome because of the unrest that was caused by the growing Christian faith among the Jewish community. So they poisoned old Uncle Claudius. They served him, according to Suetonius, his favorite dish, which was mushrooms. And I get it. I love mushrooms. Wonderful, wonderful food. And Nero, and this is so Neronian, I've no doubt at all that Nero said this. Nero ever after joked about mushrooms being the food of the gods. Because you see, long before Claudius's time, it had become the practice to deify, that is, to raise up to the level of the state god pantheon, popular emperors. And Claudius died a popular emperor, so he was deified. He was turned into a god. And so in his cruel humor, Nero was saying he had elevated his adopted father, in reality his granduncle, to the level of a god by killing him with mushrooms. Well, Nero was a cruel man, but I have to tell you, when I left last Wednesday, having seen some of your eyes, I'm afraid, glaze over because I was going on and on and on about the Romans and about the 12 Caesars. I apologize if you got more Roman than you wanted that night. But I was reminded of Nero because in this instance I was like Nero. Not in the cruelty, but in the long-winded going on and on and on with a captive audience. Some of the most horrible things Suetonius has to say about the Caesars, he says about this man. This is the Capitoline bust. In the veristic tradition, it probably is a pretty good idea of what Nero looked like. But some of the funniest things that you'll read in Suetonius are said about Nero. He was a very vain man. He thought he was a great poet and musician, and so he would compose poems and accompany himself on the lyre, basically the harp. And he would invite people into the palace to hear him. And Suetonius says that on occasion he would go on for so long that pregnant women would give birth. He wouldn't let them leave. That people would pretend to die so they would be carried out. And that's what made me think that I was like Nero the other night, because I was going on, and I got the feeling that some of you were waning in your enthusiasm for all things Roman. Well, one unfortunate person who fell asleep during one of his performances, he had thrown bodily out of the palace, just literally took him and threw him out. And Suetonius tells us that as this man came running back, he was a high functionary in the Roman court of Nero, that the steward who had overseen his being literally evicted, thrown out, he ran up to this man and he said, "But what do I do? Where do I go?" And the steward said, "Go to Hades." That's the Church of Christ way of saying what I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And so that man went off. He was posted in a dismal place, Judea, Roman Judea. His name was Vespasian. And after he became emperor, we're told, because Vespasian had a wicked sense of humor, that he had that steward thrown out. And wouldn't you know it, the guy came running back and said, "But what do I do? Where do I go?" And Vespasian laughed and said, "Go to Hades." That's worldly wisdom for you and worldly humor. And I will not do any more of it tonight. Okay, well, one of the benefits of COVID is that a lot of creative people did a lot of really interesting things. And as an artist and art historian, I love some of the things people did during quarantine. There was a guy in Canada by the name of Daniel Vauchart. He was actually a cinematographer in his day job. But what are you going to do? A worldwide pandemic is going on, and he couldn't make films. So this man took software, and he took veristic portrait busts like this one, and he made hyper-realistic portraits of these rulers. And some of these things are just amazing. So, wow, talk about bringing these people to life. These kinds of images just blow me away, and they're so great for art history and history. And so maybe this is what the real Nero looked like. He did have red hair, we know that. He liked this ruff of beard down under the chin. He was a real mess. Well, he was so unpopular that eventually he was named a public enemy of the state. The Senate actually pronounced that upon him for a sitting emperor that had never been done before. I don't think it was ever done after. And so he literally fled for his life. He took refuge with a picked bunch of friends and tried to get one of them to kill him, and the guy refused. So he took the knife, and Suetonius says he sighed, "Oh, what an artist dies with me." And then he plunged the knife in. And so he dies in the year AD 68. So what happens is the notorious year of the four emperors, AD 69. One after the other, we have these people who are making a bid for imperial purple. And so the first of them is Galba, of Hispania Tarraconensis, which is part of Spain. And his soldiers, he was a military governor, his soldiers elevated him to the purple, named him emperor. He went to Italy, and he is very briefly an emperor. But then we have an old friend, an old buddy of Nero's, Marcus Salvius Otho, whom history knows as Otho. He was governor of Lusitania, which is today Portugal. And so he goes to Rome, and his soldiers fight Galba's forces and defeat them, and Galba's killed. Briefly, Otho is emperor. Interestingly, in his treatment of Otho, Suetonius says that he was a despicable character, much like Nero, throughout his life. But when he saw that another round of civil war would follow his bid for the purple, he took his own life rather than have more Roman blood spilt. And so Suetonius says that was really the only honorable thing that man did, sparing the lives of others by taking himself out of the picture. Well, the other that was contending was Aulus Vitellius Germanicus, whom history knows as Vitellius. He was the general over the legions of Germania. Suetonius says he was a grossly overweight man, that he was constantly eating, and that he would even snatch sacrificial offerings off of the altar while they were still hot to wolf them down. So there is what we believe to be Vitellius. And then Vespasian in Judea makes his bid. And Vespasian's younger son, Domitian, is already there. He marshals the troops that Vespasian is sending him. Vitellius is defeated. Vespasian is now emperor. He is the only one of these emperors to survive this bloody year of AD 69. And with him, we have a new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. And I've already mentioned that his oldest son is Titus. He's the one who successfully prosecutes the war against the Jews, brings it to an end, and then follows his father after that war is over in AD 71. And then the third member of this group is Domitian, who is much like Caligula and Nero, despotic, cruel. It would be Nero who initiated the first major persecution of Christians, but Domitian initiates the second major persecution. A very evil, bloody man. He too was assassinated in AD 96. Even his wife was among the conspirators. Sad. I don't think anybody loved Domitian. Okay, so that's what's going on during all this time, the life of Josephus. And as I've told you, he lives on until AD 100. That's the guesstimate. And for various reasons, I'm going to briefly touch upon only one of his works, and that is the Jewish War. Well, I think I'm going to touch on the Antiquities of the Jews as well. Those are probably his two best-known works. So there's a Penguin edition of Josephus's Jewish Wars. Josephus witnessed a lot of things that you and I would consider to be definitively Roman, because the Flavians were great builders, and they built things that even today we look at and we think Roman, like the great Colosseum, probably the most iconic monument of Roman power in the world. When you look at that, if you're like me, you think Rome. And notorious because this was the place where gladiators fought, often to the death, for the entertainment of the mob of Rome. This was the place where Christians died horrible, torturous deaths at the shrieks and howls of the mob of Rome. And you may not know it, but the wealth of the Jewish campaigns went into building this, including the treasuries that were taken from the temple of God, Herod's temple. That's what funded this. And you can only imagine what God must have thought, but he allowed it. And I think a lot of irony here, a whole lot of irony. But not just that, other definitive monuments of the Roman world, triumphal arches. This one is one of the best preserved in Rome. Originally, there would have been triumphal arches in any city or even town of any size, because these were a staple of Roman culture. They're a symbol of Rome's triumph in arms over her enemies. And that's why they're called triumphal arches. This one is, again, probably the best known. It's called the Arch of Titus. Properly, it should be called the Arch of Vespasian and Titus, because it is literally intended to celebrate the victory of the Roman people over the Jews between AD 66 and 70. And there's the dedicatory plaque, which reads, Senatus Populusque Romanos Divo Tito Divi Vespasiani, the god Titus, the god Vespasian. That alone indicates to us that both of them are dead already. And then the F for Filio, the son of Vespasiano Augusto. So basically, the Roman Senate and people dedicate this to the divine Titus, Vespasianus Augustus, son of the divine Vespasian. So this is a major monument that celebrates the victory of the Romans in arms over the Jewish people. And I'm told that even today, a Jew as a tourist will not go under that arch, because to do so is shameful in the Jewish world. And I can understand that. I can certainly understand it. In the Entrados, which is the peak of the arch as you're going under it, and there are tourists there that give you a sense of scale. The thing is about 40 feet in height. But in the peak of it, you see Titus being lifted up to heaven on the back of an eagle. This is an apotheosis scene, a raising up to the divine status. So the long-held understanding is that Domitian, the younger brother of Titus, had this built to honor his father Vespasian and Titus, but Vespasian long dead before this is built. Titus is the person who gets the focal point. And we know it's Titus because we have other images of him. And if you look closely there, you can make out the pudgy cheeks and face. So there he is being carried up to glory. Well, the whole point of a triumphal arch is the triumph. And no, I'm not talking about a car. But it's a great name for a car. So that word triumph, you may not be aware of the fact that it comes out of a great procession, which itself is intended to celebrate a great victory over an enemy. And for the Romans, a despised and hated enemy, whom they saw as really an enemy to their way of life, their state, their culture, their power. You actually had to have certain credentials in order to qualify for triumph. As best as I recall, and I'm gleaning from memory, about 65,000 minimum slain in battle, a certain amount of spoils. Great captives are also a big plus. In other words, you had to make a big splash in the military history of Rome to qualify, to even be considered for a triumph. And if all of those credentials were there, then the Senate, having deliberated, would approve a triumph. A day would be marked on the calendar. All the spoils and preparations would be gathered together. The victorious general would not be allowed to cross the pomerium, or the line, the boundary into Roman territory, until he was crossing for the triumph, because to do so under arms was treasonous. And so he had to wait on the outskirts while all of the preparations are made before he could cross over on the day of. And then right before I came to be with you, I quickly put together some things that I've had in my files for a long time that hopefully give you a sense of the actual triumph. So this is a great procession on that picked gala day, and we have standard bearers who are going through the streets, who are leading the way with the standards of the victorious legions who actually prosecuted this war. We have the image of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the chief god of the Roman pantheon, Jupiter, the greatest and the best. We have the spoils of war, treasures of gold and silver, ivory, if this is something that comes from North Africa, all kinds of precious stones and treasures of the defeated peoples that had been conquered by this victorious general. We have pipers blowing on their flutes. The aulos is a double flute that allows two pitches, and that's what I have here in my recreation. Sacrificial bulls would be led, and you can imagine the lowing of the cattle as this is going on, because often, in fact almost always, there was a celebratory feast afterward where, having sacrificed these animals, their meat would be roasted, tables would be put out, and as many people in Rome that could get there and get something would be feasted with the best food and wine, among them the sacrificial bulls, and the general is paying for a lot of this, if not all of it. Behind that, we have prisoners and guards. We have horn players blowing on the horns and trumpets. We have captive chieftains, including kings, who sometimes are shackled, sometimes riding. We have really a panoply of prisoners and their weapons. And so on this elevated sort of stretcher thing, that's what you have here, with soldiers who are carrying this, and then shackled prisoners are surrounding really a fixture of the arms of the defeated soldiers who had fallen and been defeated and deprived of their weapons in battle. And then more chained prisoners. And then behind all of that, a very bald, naked statement of Roman power. And these are the lictors. So these are officers who are given the symbol of the fasces, from which we get our word fascism. Mussolini tried to revive really the ancient Roman world, saw himself as a Roman Caesar in World War II period. And so the fasces were very popular in fascist Italy during World War II. But this is one of the old symbols of the Republican system. And lictors would be appointed to magistrates at every level. And depending on how high up you were, you would have more or less lictors. These were men who were basically bodyguards, but they also carried the fasces, which was a bundle of rods with an axe stuck in them. And so the message for Roman people at that time was clear. This man, the magistrate, the cruel judge, he has the power to punish immediately. And if he so designates, then the fasces will be taken apart and you might be beaten on the spot. If you really are guilty of a terrible offense, you could have your head chopped off. An honorable way of death for a Roman because it's quick and relatively painless. So this is, as I've said, a naked ball symbol of power. And we embraced it in America. If you look at early American painting, you'll find the fasces over and over again because it's a symbol of Rome. And the rods bound together also symbolize the strength of the many who come together in unity. It's hard to break a threefold cord or a bunch of rods. And is it still on our Franklin D. Roosevelt dime? It used to be. So that's a dime. I don't know if you can make out the fasces, but this is a lingering symbol of ancient Rome that you'll still see from time to time. Yes, on the arms of his throne, on the Lincoln Monument. Yeah, you're right. It's in a lot of paintings. Okay, and then after that, the triumphant general. And he comes toward the end of the whole thing. And if you look really, really closely, let me see if I can. Here's the general. Look at this guy behind him. If you're looking over here, here's the general. Here's the guy behind him. So you got to love this. He painted his face. This was an old ritual. He painted his face with a red dye called minim. So his face was stark red. He's dressed in his best toga. If he's of senatorial class, it'll have a broad purple stripe, which indicates that. And the guy behind him is a slave, probably an honored, trusted slave of his own household, almost like a son. And this guy's holding a laurel wreath over his head. And we're told that he's constantly whispering, "Remember, you are still immortal." Lest in the adulation of the crowd, he forget and he thinks somehow I've become a god. So I think that's really interesting because all the crowd of Rome are there to cheer and to clap and to hurrah because Rome is triumphed again. And all of the spoils and all of the wealth of this defeated enemy now are coming into the Roman coffers with a heavy percentage that goes into the general's private treasury as well. And then to seal it all off, at the very back, you have the senators and the magistrates, the seating officers of government who are behind all of this and literally supporting it all. And there may be even more soldiers after that. All of these people are winding their way through the streets of Rome up to the Via Sacra, the sacred way, the heart of the Forum. And at some point, they will go through a temporary wooden arch erected for this purpose, to be the climax of the whole thing. And that's intended to represent that Rome has now entered into a new phase of her glorious history. The Triumphal Arch is a pointless monument in its being an architectural structure because it's a gate to nowhere. There are no walls around it. But it's a monument of great military and political and historical significance because it marks, again, Rome's entry into a new chapter of its history, having defeated this enemy that is celebrated through this thing. So we actually have Josephus' description of the actual triumph of Vespasian and Titus. And the artist who painted this painting, I don't know if you can make it out, But here we have the triumphal chariot right here. And we have a man on a white horse. That comes right out of Josephus. Josephus says that Domitian did not ride in the triumphal car with Vespasian and Titus, but he rode a white charger and was with them in that capacity. And so this is right up the Via Sacra, right through the triumphal way, and going by the great archives of Rome, right off the Forum. Okay, so contrast that with this. What an amazing contrast. It was no accident that Christ had his own triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the city of David. In fact, Zechariah had prophesied it in Zechariah 9. And these events are discussed in the Gospels, Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19, and John 12. And this is not at all that. There's no wealth, there's no gold and silver, there's certainly no pagan idol. There's not legions of soldiers, bared steel. There are no pathetic captives who are waiting their turn after all of this is over to be cast into really a pit after they're strangled. That was the fate of the chief enemies, the generals and the kings. And sometimes there were kings in these. Instead, we just have a man from Galilee who's riding on the back of the foal of a donkey, upon whom no one had ever sat before. In the Roman world, the horse, the charger, was a symbol of war, of power and speed. This is the symbol of peace. And this follows the paradoxical wisdom of God. The same God who thought it fit that the Savior of humanity, the one through whom all was made, would be born virtually in a stable. Apologies, Brother Dutch. I'm referring to the traditional. Whereas Augustus thought he was the Savior of humanity, and he wasn't. Well, the same God, of course, thinks it proper that the real Savior, the real triumpher, comes into Jerusalem, the city of David, at the shout of Hosanna, King of the highest, and palm fronds and clothes and cloth. Very different. But this is the counter to that. And there was no accident here. God was countering with his plan the glories of Rome with their plan. And what a contrast. What a contrast. Well, this arch was erected for that purpose. And so there are actually reliefs not only in the intrados, the crown of the arch, but on either side of the arch, which actually shows the procession that Josephus described. And among the spoils of war side, you see the seven-branched menorah that was in the temple of Herod and in the temple of Solomon as well. These were among the spoils of war that were brought back by the Romans, led by Titus. And on the other side of the arch is the triumphal car. And as I said, this was created long after Vespasian, so Titus is the one seated there. We know it's Titus because, again, although the head is damaged, you can see enough of his face to determine that this is the guy. Budgy face, heavy cheeks. He was apparently a big man. Well, I always, in my classes, when I'm covering this monument, I always like to put a little bit more in here, and here is the little bit more. I'm reminded here of what we read in Matthew. Do you remember that strange scene, Matthew 24, when Christ is on the Temple Mount and the apostles are marveling at the Herodian stonework, and they are saying, look at these big stones. And Christ says, I tell you now, not one of these stones will be left on another. And they want to know more. And so he goes into this discourse where apparently he intertwines elements that speak of the coming Jewish wars of AD 70. Well, that's the culminating year. But he also is speaking about end times as well. And a lot of biblical scholars really have problem figuring out what is actually going on here. Well, here's a really relevant passage. Therefore, Christ said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, he's quoting Daniel, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Clearly, this passage, he's talking about something in history, not the end times. Because if this is the end times, what does it matter if you flee to the hills? God's going to find you. He's talking here, I believe, and I say this as if this is original to me, it is not. He's talking here about the fall of Jerusalem, where we're told that not stone on stone was left. Apparently, Titus wanted to preserve the temple, but a fire broke out, and the fire was hot, and the gold, some of it, not all of it clearly, but some of it melted. And to get at that melted gold, the soldiers literally took the temple apart, stone by stone. The abomination of desolation, what on earth is that? I think it's this. The eagle symbol was the symbol that really led the legions, and it was more than a standard. It was an idol. The legions looked up to it, they fought for it, they died for it, many of them. They offered incense to it. What could be more evocative of an abomination in the eyes of God and God's people than an idol? And when that went in, desolation followed, destruction. I think Christ here and Daniel are talking about the eagles. When the eagles, the Roman eagles go in, you better get out because it's not going to be good what follows. And it wasn't. Josephus says that this was a destruction virtually like none other. And we have different reports in addition to his about this. This is one of the history paintings that I've got by David Roberts, a Scottish painter, The Siege and Destruction of Jerusalem. Here's another one by, I think he's Portuguese, Francesco Hayes, The Destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. The temple was the last resort. That's where the zealots held out and fortified. And when the Romans went in, the zealots were thrown over what's sometimes called the high point, the high place. And that's just off of one of the angles of the temple itself. And that's what Hayes is depicting. Well, Josephus is a witness to these things. As I've said, he adapts the Flavian name. I'm almost done. I'm not going to get to Pliny. Jay, please don't make a pun. So here is one of Vespasian's coins, and it actually shows Vespasian with the triumphal car. But in the Antiquities of the Jews, this one is really, really interesting. So now we're getting right to the point, in addition to his corroborative account of the triumph. This is called the Jesus inscription, or the Jesus quote, where in the Antiquities of the Jews, where from his perspective, he's giving the history of the Jewish people, Josephus says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. We all know that Christ is not a last name, it's a title. Mashiach, I think, is the Jewish pronunciation, Messiah. It means the anointed one, the Christ. Now, I read that and I pause to let that sink in. Some scholars think that that is a later interpolation, something that a pious believer stuck in their translation of Josephus. But in any case, I think it's really interesting. He goes on to say, and when Pilate, here's another historical reference to Pilate that's not in the Bible, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. Wow, that's really interesting. Is that part of the interpolation too? As the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, he says, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So again, this is from the Antiquities of the Jews. I've got the William Whiston edition. That's really interesting, and it's hard to determine what is an interpolation and what is Josephus. And if it's all Josephus, why was he not a Christian? I don't know. But we're out of time, so I'm going to have to forestall Pliny, and we'll look at Pliny, who was a great letter writer and one of the Roman officers in the court of Trajan, one of the so-called 5 good emperors, when we hopefully are able to meet again next Wednesday. Let's have a prayer. Thank you, Father, for your word and the truth that it brings to us. Thank you for these other words that help us to better understand the people and the time in which the events of Old and New Testament are recording. And I pray that we might continue to open our hearts and minds to the truth that we find within the Bible, and not be averse, not be against further enlightening ourselves as regards other sources that might help us to better understand your word, but holding your word first and foremost in our hearts and minds. Thank you for the faith that we can gain through a proper and careful reading of your word and through prayer and devotion. Thank you for our body here at Westside. Brother Eric has mentioned many people that are on our hearts, but I particularly want to mention again Brother Fred Duncan. I also want to mention Sister Carol Farrar. She's gone through so much, and I pray that you would comfort her and help us to encourage her and elevate her spirits. I pray also for Brother Steve Moore. I pray for the Chances, and I pray for all of those, Lord, who are struggling and who are needing encouragement. Help us to be the people you've called us to be, to offer that encouragement, to bear those griefs and burdens, to rejoice when they rejoice. Thank you most of all for Christ. It's in his name that we take comfort and hope and the example that is ever before us. I pray all of this in his name. Amen.